Bharati's calm smile hit a storm, and Lena unknowingly walked straight into it. Said. Bharati lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood where every house looked peaceful from the outside, yet every resident carried their own secrets. She was a responsible mother to her young daughter, Asha, and worked long hours to provide a stable life. To the people around her, she seemed disciplined, polite, and perfectly controlled. No one suspected the emotional storm she carried within. For years, Bharati had lived in fear of judgment from her ex-husband and society, forcing her to hide the most important part of her personal life, her relationship with Ria. She wasn't hiding it because she felt ashamed. She was terrified of losing custody of her daughter. Her ex-husband frequently threatened legal action, creating constant anxiety that any small detail about her private world could be used against her. This pressure slowly shaped her daily routine. Every step she took was calculated, every conversation monitored, and every friend carefully chosen. Her connection with Ria was the only space where she felt understood, yet even that love existed behind closed curtains and whispered messages. This secrecy created a silent weight that grew heavier over the years. Bharati felt as if she was living two separate lives, one for the world and one for survival. As time passed, the burden of maintaining a hidden identity began to affect her mental stability. Simple changes in Ria's routine made her anxious, and normal interactions felt threatening. Bharati didn't realize how fragile her emotional balance had become. She believed she was protecting her daughter and her relationship, unaware that her fear-driven world was slowly leading her into a dangerous direction she could no longer control. Ria's life had recently become busier, and Bharati noticed the shift immediately. At first, it was small things, messages coming late, calls cut short, plans postponed. The changes were ordinary, but to someone already living under emotional pressure, they felt unsettling. The biggest shift came when Ria mentioned a new colleague named Lena. She described her as friendly, talented, and easy to work with. For most people, this would be harmless information, but for Bharati, it triggered a quiet uneasiness she couldn't explain. She had spent years fearing instability, and any unexpected person entering Ria's life felt like a potential disruption to the fragile balance she had worked so hard to maintain. Bharati started noticing every detail related to Lena: social media photos from office events, group outings, and lighthearted comments shared between colleagues. None of it indicated anything unusual, yet Bharati's mind interpreted each moment as a sign of her life slipping away. She had built her emotional world around predictability, routine, and secrecy. When something unexpected appeared, even something harmless, it felt like a threat. The more she tried to ignore her thoughts, the more they grew. She imagined scenarios where Ria's priorities changed, leaving her with no stability, no support, and no one to rely on. She convinced herself that small signs meant something bigger, something dangerous to the life she wanted to protect. What Bharati didn't realize was that the real issue wasn't Lena at all. It was her own fear of losing the only emotional anchor she trusted. This fear quietly evolved into an unhealthy fixation, slowly shaping her decisions in ways she could no longer recognize as abnormal. ChatGPT said, Bharati's growing uneasiness slowly turned into a quiet obsession that wrapped itself around her daily routine. She began paying attention to every moment Ria spent online, every post she liked, and every person she interacted with. What started as harmless curiosity became a habit she couldn't control. She created a private notebook where she recorded small observations, times, dates, locations, even assumptions that had no real basis. The act of writing gave her a temporary sense of control, but it also fed the very fears she was trying to calm. Each entry made the imagined threat feel more real. She checked Ria's office schedules, reviewed old messages, and replayed conversations in her mind, searching for hidden meanings that didn't actually exist. The more she analyzed, the more distorted her thinking became. Normal work outings appeared suspicious, friendly gestures seemed calculated, and even moments of silence felt like warnings. Bharati convinced herself she wasn't being irrational. She believed she was protecting her future, her daughter, and everything she had built in secret. As the days passed, this obsession started affecting her behavior at home. She slept less, ate irregularly, and kept her phone close as if expecting danger at any moment. Her anxiety grew whenever Ria was out of sight, and she felt an overwhelming urge to track her movements, believing it was the only way to stay safe. Bharathi never saw her thoughts as unhealthy. To her, they were survival instincts shaped by years of fear and secrecy. But without realizing it, she had stepped into a mental space where logic no longer guided her decisions, and every imagined scenario pushed her further toward a dark, irreversible path. The tension inside Bharathi reached its peak on a seemingly ordinary weekend. Ria had promised to visit, and Bharathi planned the entire day with careful precision, hoping for a sense of reassurance after weeks of rising anxiety. But on the morning of their meeting, Ria sent a brief message saying she couldn't come. The office team, led by Lena, had arranged a sudden out-of-city trip. It was a completely normal workplace plan, but to Bharathi, it felt like a final confirmation of the fears she had been collecting in her mind. What she read in that message was not a simple cancellation. It was abandonment, change, and uncertainty all at once. The disappointment hit her harder than she expected. Her mind replayed every interaction between Ria and Lena, stitching them together into a narrative that only existed inside her imagination. She spent the entire day pacing around the house, unable to settle, unable to think clearly. Every hour that passed made her feel more certain that she was losing control over her life. The fear she carried for years, the secrecy she guarded so tightly, and the constant pressure of protecting her daughter's future all collided into one overwhelming thought. She needed to eliminate anything that threatened her fragile world. By nightfall, her mental state had shifted completely. What began as sadness turned into a twisted form of resolve. She convinced herself she was acting out of necessity, not anger. Her desperation masked itself as protection, and her thoughts no longer followed reason or morality. In her distressed mind, removing the perceived threat seemed like the only way to secure the stability she had been fighting for. She didn't recognize it as a breaking point, but it was the moment her fear transformed into something far more dangerous, pushing her toward a path from which she could never return. The tension inside Bharathi reached its peak on a seemingly ordinary weekend. Ria had promised to visit, and Bharathi planned the entire day with careful precision, hoping for a sense of reassurance after weeks of rising anxiety. But on the morning of their meeting, Ria sent a brief message saying she couldn't come. The office team, led by Lena, had arranged a sudden out-of-city trip. It was a completely normal workplace plan, but to Bharathi, it felt like a final confirmation of the fears she had been collecting in her mind. What she read in that message was not a simple cancellation. It was abandonment, change, and uncertainty all at once. The disappointment hit her harder than she expected. Her mind replayed every interaction between Ria and Lena, stitching them together into a narrative that only existed inside her imagination. She spent the entire day pacing around the house, unable to settle, unable to think clearly. Every hour that passed made her feel more certain that she was losing control over her life. The fear she carried for years, the secrecy she guarded so tightly, and the constant pressure of protecting her daughter's future all collided into one overwhelming thought. She needed to eliminate anything that threatened her fragile world. By nightfall, her mental state had shifted completely. What began as sadness turned into a twisted form of resolve. She convinced herself she was acting out of necessity, not anger. Her desperation masked itself as protection, and her thoughts no longer followed reason or morality. In her distressed mind, removing the perceived threat seemed like the only way to secure the stability she had been fighting for. She didn't recognize it as a breaking point, but it was the moment her fear transformed into something far more dangerous, pushing her toward a path from which she could never return. Lena followed her usual weekday routine, unaware that someone had been observing her movements for weeks. She left her apartment, walked to the parking area, and headed toward the office as she always did. Everything around her looked normal, traffic moving steadily, people hurrying to their jobs, and the familiar sound of morning chaos in the city. Hidden among all this ordinary activity, Bharathi had already positioned herself in a spot where she could watch without being noticed. Her decision, shaped by days of fear and distorted thoughts, had set a dangerous plan in motion long before the day even began. Bharathi believed she was acting out of necessity. She had convinced herself that removing Lena would stabilize her world, protect her relationship, and prevent her already fragile life from collapsing. Her reasoning was no longer rooted in reality. It was fueled by anxiety, obsession, and the weight of secrecy she had carried for years. She followed Lena from a distance, waiting for a moment when no one else was nearby. The isolated stretch near the office parking area gave her exactly that. The act itself was swift, executed with the precision of someone who had rehearsed the moment repeatedly in her mind. Lena didn't expect danger, which made her completely vulnerable. After the attack, Bharathi acted with unsettling calmness. She disposed of evidence methodically, wiped away anything that could connect her to the scene, and tried to return to her normal routine as if nothing had happened. However, even the most carefully constructed plan is never perfect. Small details slipped through, digital traces, an unnoticed witness, and inconsistencies in timing. These cracks were invisible to Bharathi in the moment, but they would soon become the threads investigators pulled to unravel the truth. The investigation into Lena's disappearance began within hours of her failing to arrive at work. Her colleagues reported her absence immediately because she was known for being punctual and responsible. Police started with routine checks, phone records, last known locations, and CCTV footage around her apartment and workplace. What initially seemed like a missing person case quickly shifted into something more serious when officers noticed unusual gaps in the timeline. Her phone had stopped transmitting signals near the office parking area, and the CCTV cameras captured a few seconds of unclear movement that hinted at a struggle. Even though the images were blurred, investigators found enough irregularities to suspect foul play. As the search widened, attention gradually turned toward anyone connected to Lena through work or personal life. Bharathi's name surfaced unexpectedly during a digital sweep. Investigators discovered multiple instances of her phone being in the same locations as Lena's over several days, including times when there was no reasonable explanation for her presence. This pattern sparked curiosity. The officers initially considered it a coincidence, but the more they examined, the more the data pointed toward deliberate tracking. When detectives questioned Bharathi for the first time, she appeared calm, almost overly composed. Her answers were polite, but some details felt rehearsed. She attempted to distance herself from Ria's workplace, yet her phone data contradicted her statements. These inconsistencies raised red flags. The turning point came when investigators searched her home. Hidden inside a drawer, they found the notebook she had used to document her observations about Ria and Lena. Page after page revealed a disturbing level of monitoring. It wasn't just curiosity, it was systematic surveillance. The notebook became the missing link, exposing the motive rooted in fear, obsession, and emotional collapse. With this evidence, the investigation suddenly had clarity, and Bharathi became the primary suspect as the case moved toward its final stages. As evidence continued to mount, the pressure on Bharathi grew heavier than she could manage. At first, she tried to maintain the same calm, controlled appearance she had shown during earlier questioning. She kept her voice steady, rehearsed her explanations, and attempted to appear confused whenever investigators pressed her on specific details. But the facade began to break the moment detectives presented her with concrete proof she couldn't ignore. Her phone records placed her near the crime scene at the exact time of Lena's disappearance, and witness statements contradicted her version of events. Each new piece of information chipped away at the careful image she had constructed. Sleep became impossible. She lay awake at night replaying her actions, convincing herself she had covered her tracks, only to be haunted by the fear that she had overlooked something critical. The constant tension made her irritable, distracted, and visibly anxious. Small mistakes in everyday interactions revealed that she was losing control. Even Ria noticed subtle changes, shaking hands, sudden mood shifts, long periods of silence, but she didn't understand their cause. During the next round of questioning, Bharathi's contradictions became more frequent. She mixed up dates, changed her statements, and offered explanations that no longer aligned with the forensic evidence. The detectives recognized the signs of someone struggling to hold on to a collapsing narrative. Her breaking point came when she learned that the notebook found in her home had been fully analyzed. The investigators now understood the extent of her obsession, and they confronted her with the disturbing level of detail she had recorded. At that moment, Bharati's carefully built defenses crumbled. Her body trembled, her voice faltered, and all the exhaustion she had been suppressing overwhelmed her. She realized there was nothing left to hide behind. The truth, shaped by fear and unraveling mental stability, finally surfaced, not as a confession motivated by remorse, but as a release from the unbearable weight of her own deteriorating mind. The aftermath of the case unfolded slowly, leaving a trail of emotional damage that stretched far beyond the crime itself. Once Bharati confessed, the public viewed her as a calculated offender, but psychologists who evaluated her saw someone who had been struggling with deep internal pressure for years. Their assessment revealed severe emotional instability driven by fear, secrecy, and prolonged stress. This finding changed the course of her punishment. Instead of being placed in a traditional prison, she was sent to a psychiatric facility where she would undergo long-term treatment. The decision sparked debate, but experts agreed that her actions stemmed from a mental collapse rather than deliberate malice. Ria, meanwhile, found herself caught between shock and guilt. She had never imagined that an ordinary shift in her routine could trigger such a tragic chain of events. Her grief for Lena mixed with a heavy sense of responsibility, even though she had played no role in the crime. Taking custody of Asha became her priority. She wanted to provide stability for the child, who had already been living under the strain of secrecy and tension without fully understanding it. Ria focused on creating a calm environment, hoping to shield Asha from further trauma. As investigators continued reviewing the case, they discovered a final, heartbreaking twist. Through messages and notes found on Lena's phone, it became clear that she had admired Bharati from a distance. She had planned to approach her as a friend, hoping to build a positive connection. There had never been any threat, rivalry, or intention to disrupt anyone's life. If Bharati had sought clarity instead of relying on fear-driven assumptions, the tragedy might have been avoided. The case became a stark reminder of how unchecked anxiety and hidden turmoil can twist perception, turning imagined dangers into irreversible actions that destroy every life involved.